In 1873, Wyoming, when the westbound train pulled away from Millbrook Station, it left behind more than just dust and disappointment. Annalise Ward stood alone on that wooden platform, one hand pressed against her growing belly, the other clutching a carpetbag that held everything she owned. The fire that had claimed half her face 3 months earlier had also claimed her future, or so she believed. The townspeople whispered behind gloved hands. A disfigured mail-order bride, abandoned by her intended groom the moment he laid eyes on her scars. No respectable family would take her in, no man would have her now, but Luke Carver wasn't like other men. The struggling rancher saw something in her eyes that had nothing to do with the twisted skin along her cheek. He saw a woman who deserved kindness, not pity. What happens when two broken souls discover that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the deepest wounds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Station as the 7:15 westbound locomotive disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a trail of black smoke and the acrid smell of coal. The platform, weathered by countless departures and arrivals, seemed to hold its breath in the sudden quiet. Only one passenger remained, a young woman who stood as still as carved marble, her world having just collapsed around her. Annalise Ward pressed her fingers against the rough wool of her traveling dress, feeling the slight curve of her belly beneath the fabric. 4 months along, though she'd hidden it well during the journey from Philadelphia, the child within her stirred, a flutter of movement that once brought her joy, but now felt like a weight she could barely carry. The left side of her face bore the angry red marks of scars that were still healing, twisted skin that pulled at the corner of her mouth and ran from her temple down to her jaw. 3 months ago, she had been preparing for her wedding to Thomas Brennan, a merchant's son who had courted her with gentle words and promises of a comfortable life. The fire that swept through her boarding house had changed everything in a matter of minutes. She remembered waking to the smell of smoke, the screams of other tenants, the heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A falling beam had pinned her against the wall, the flames licking at her face before neighbors pulled her free. The physical pain had been excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the look in Thomas's eyes when he first saw her in the hospital. Bed, horror, revulsion, and something worse, disappointment. "I cannot marry you like this," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My family's reputation, my business connections, surely you understand." She had understood, perhaps better than he realized. In that moment, she saw herself through. His eyes, damaged goods, a burden, a woman whose value had been measured in her appearance and found wanting. When his offer came a week later, a train ticket west, and the promise that someone out there might not mind, she had taken it, along with his monthly payment to ensure the child would be born far from Philadelphia's gossip circles. The station master, a portly man named Henderson, approached with obvious reluctance, his logbook tucked under one arm. He cleared his throat and avoided looking directly at her face. "Miss Ward, is it?" His voice carried the careful politeness reserved for uncomfortable situations. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. Mr. Morrison, your intended, he left word that that the arrangement has been called off." Annalise felt something cold settle in her stomach. Called off? He took one look. Henderson's words trailed off as he gestured vaguely toward her scars. "Left on the morning train to Denver, said to tell you he's real sorry, but a man has to think of his standing in the community." The words hung in the air like smoke from the departed locomotive, standing in the community. How many times had she heard those words in the past months? How many people had explained away their cruelty with concerns about appearances, reputations, what others might think? "I see." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "And what am I to do now?" Henderson shuffled his feet, his discomfort obvious. "Well, I suppose there's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Hutchins runs it, though I can't say." He cleared his throat again. "The church might have suggestions. Reverend Patterson's a good man, Christian charity and all that." But even as he spoke, she could see in his eyes that he didn't believe his own words. Christian charity had limits, especially when it came to unmarried women carrying children, particularly those whose faces served as constant reminders of life's fragility. From across the platform, she noticed other passengers from her train car, a well-dressed family with 2 young children, whispering among themselves and casting quick glances in her direction. The mother pulled her daughter closer, as if scarred faces might be contagious. The father shook his head with the practiced disapproval of a man who had never faced a moment's uncertainty about his place in the world. "The boarding house," Annalise said finally. "How much does Mrs. Hutchins charge? $2 a week? Meals included?" Henderson's tone suggested he knew this was far beyond her means. She opened her carpetbag and counted the contents carefully. $7.36, everything left after purchasing her train ticket and meals for the 3-day journey. Enough for 3 weeks, perhaps 4 if she ate sparingly. After that, "I'll need directions," she said, lifting her chin with what remained of her dignity. As Henderson scribbled on a piece of paper, Annalise caught sight of her reflection in the station window. For a moment, she saw not the scars, but the woman she had been, the one who had laughed easily, who had believed in happy endings, who had never doubted that she deserved love. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had known briefly and lost in the flames. But she was still here, still standing, still breathing. Perhaps that was enough to start with. 5 miles outside Millbrook, Luke Carver wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed the broken fence post that had claimed his. "Morning." The wood had rotted through at the base. Another expense he couldn't afford. Another reminder that his father's ranch was slowly crumbling around him like everything else in his life. At 28, Luke had the weathered hands of a man twice. His age and the quiet demeanor of someone who had learned early that the world wasn't particularly interested in what he had to say. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean from years of hard work and leaner meals, with dark hair that refused to stay combed and brown eyes that held more sadness than a man his age should carry. The Carver Ranch had been in his family for 23 years, carved out of the Wyoming wilderness by his father, Samuel, who had believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Samuel had been wrong about many things, but he'd been especially wrong about that. When he died 2 years ago, he'd left Luke not just the ranch, but also the debts that came with it. Money owed to the bank, to suppliers, to neighbors who had helped with cattle drives and never been properly repaid. Luke pulled the land deed from his shirt pocket, a habit he'd developed over the past months. The paper was worn soft from folding and unfolding, the ink slightly faded but still legible. "Samuel Carver and his heirs," it read, "in consideration of $500 and other valuable considerations." Those other valuable considerations had included back-breaking labor, sleepless nights, and the slow erosion of hope. His father had always said Luke wasn't quite right for ranch life. "You think too much," Samuel would say, usually after Luke had suggested a different approach to breaking horses or questioned whether they should plant winter wheat in the south pasture. A rancher needs to act, not wonder, but Luke had inherited the ranch anyway, mainly because there was no one else. His older brother, James, had headed to California during the gold rush and never returned. His sister, Mary, had married a banker in Denver and made it clear that she considered the ranch a relic of their father's foolish dreams. So it fell to Luke, the son who thought too much, who was too gentle with the animals, who read books by lamplight instead of falling into bed exhausted like a proper rancher should. The cattle were scattered across the far pasture, black dots, against the brown grass that stretched toward the mountains. They were good stock, strong and healthy, but there weren't enough of them. The bank wanted $200 by the end of the month, money Luke didn't have and couldn't see any way of getting. He'd considered selling some of the herd, But cattle prices had dropped after the harsh winter, and he needed every head to have any hope of making it through another year. A meadowlark called from a fence post, its song bright and clear in the morning air. Luke paused to listen, remembering how his mother used to say that meadowlarks sang to chase away sorrow. Sarah Carver had been the heart of the ranch, the one who made the endless work feel worthwhile. She died when Luke was 16, taking with her the laughter that had once filled the small farmhouse and leaving behind two men who didn't know how to talk to each other. Luke's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Patience, snorted and stamped her, effete, eager to return to the barn. She was one of his father's better investments, calm, reliable, and smart enough to work cattle without constant direction. Like Luke, she'd learned to make do with less, to find satisfaction in small victories and steady progress. The farmhouse sat in a small valley, protected from the worst of the winter winds by a grove of cottonwoods his parents had planted their first year on the land. It was a simple structure, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a front room with a stone fireplace that his father had built stone by stone. The roof needed patching, the porch steps sagged, and the paint had long since faded to weathered grey. But it was still home. Inside, everything remained exactly as his mother had left it. Her sewing basket sat beside her rocking chair, her apron still hung on the kitchen hook, and her Bible lay open on the table to the Psalms she'd read every morning. Luke couldn't bring himself to change anything, as if disturbing her belongings might erase the last traces of her presence. He'd been alone for 2 years now, cooking his own meals, mending his own clothes, talking only to the animals and the occasional neighbor who stopped by. The isolation had become a familiar companion, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply a condition of his life, like the dry Wyoming wind or the endless cycle of seasons. But lately the quiet had begun to feel different, heavier somehow, as if the ranch itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Luke couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in the pause between one life and another, though he had no idea what that next life might look like. He folded the deed carefully and returned it to his pocket, then gathered his tools and headed toward the barn. There was always work to be done, always something that needed fixing or tending. It was a rhythm he understood, even when everything else felt uncertain. The meadowlark called again, and Luke found himself hoping, despite everything, that his mother had been right about their songs. Luke had ridden into town for supplies he couldn't afford, hoping to negotiate another month's credit at Morrison's general store. The October afternoon carried the crisp promise of winter, and he pulled his worn coat tighter as he guided Patience down Main Street toward the train station. He needed to pick up a package, replacement parts for his plow that he'd ordered weeks ago and dreaded paying for. The station platform was nearly empty except for Henderson's sweeping dust that would return before he finished, and a lone woman sitting on a bench beside a single carpetbag. Something about her stillness caught his attention, the way she held herself so carefully, as if movement itself required great effort. Luke dismounted and tied Patience to the hitching post, stealing glances at the woman as he approached the station office. She was young, perhaps early 20s, with dark hair pinned back beneath a simple bonnet. Her dress was well made, but travel-worn, and she kept her face turned away from the street, gazing instead toward the empty tracks that stretched into the distance. "Afternoon, Henderson," Luke said as he entered the small office. "Got a package?" "For Carver." "Sure do." Henderson handed over a wrapped bundle, then lowered his voice. "Say, Luke, you being a Christian man and all, there's a situation out there that's got me troubled." Luke glanced through the window toward the woman on the bench. "Ma'am's been waiting for someone. More like someone was supposed to be waiting for her." Henderson shook his head. "Mail order bride from back east." Morrison took one look and caught the next train to Denver, left her sitting there with nowhere to go and no money to get back home. "That's unfortunate." Luke counted out coins for his package, trying to ignore the way Henderson was looking at him expectantly. "Mrs. Hutchins couldn't put her up?" "You seen the woman, Luke?" Henderson's voice dropped even lower. She's been in some kind of accident. Scars on her face, something fierce. Mrs. Hutchins says it would upset her other boarders." Luke felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen enough cruelty in his 28 years to recognize it in all its forms. The casual dismissal of those deemed inconvenient, the careful way people avoided their responsibility to help when helping came with complications. "She's in child too," Henderson added. Morrison knew that apparently, just didn't know about the other thing. Through the window, Luke watched the woman shift slightly on the bench, her hand moving to rest on her stomach in a gesture so protective it made his chest ache. He thought of his mother's wooden cross, the one she'd carved during the long winter when she was carrying the baby who hadn't lived to see spring. Sarah Carver had believed that every person deserved dignity, especially those that others found easy to overlook. "What's her name?" Luke asked quietly. "Annalise Ward." Luke hefted his package and walked outside, his boots echoing on the wooden platform. The woman, Annalise, looked up as he approached, and he saw that Henderson hadn't exaggerated. The left side of her face bore the twisted marks of serious burns, the skin pulled tight and still angry-looking. But her eyes were clear and intelligent, holding a mixture of wariness and determination that reminded him of an injured animal that refused to give up. "Miss Ward?" His voice sounded rougher than he'd intended. "I'm Luke Carver. I hear you're in need of assistance." She studied his face carefully, as if trying to read his intentions. "I don't take charity, Mr. Carver." Wasn't offering charity. He shifted his package to his other arm. "I have a barn that needs tending, and my cooking could use improvement. If you're willing to work, I'm willing to provide room and board." "Your barn?" The skepticism in her voice was plain. "It's clean and dry, better than some places I've stayed." Luke found himself looking past her scars to the person beneath them. "There's a small room in the back where we store feed. Has a window and a stove for heat. Not fancy, but it's private." Annalise was quiet for a long moment, her hand still, resting protectively over her child. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" The honest answer was complicated, something about the way she held herself with dignity despite everything, something about the protective gesture over her unborn child, something about his mother's voice in his memory saying that kindness costs nothing but means everything. Instead, he said simply, "Everyone deserves a chance. The townspeople won't approve. The townspeople don't pay my bills or tell me how to run my ranch." A faint smile tugged at the uninjured corner of her mouth. "You're either very kind or very foolish, Mr. Carver. Probably both." Luke extended his hand to help her up. "But the offer stands." Annalise looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then took it. Her fingers were cold but steady. "I accept your offer, Mr. Carver, and I promise you won't regret it." As they walked toward his horse, Luke touched the small wooden cross in his pocket, his mother's last gift to him, carved with her own hands during her final winter. He had the strangest feeling that Sarah Carver would have approved of this moment, of this choice to see past the surface to the person beneath. Sometimes, he thought, the most important decisions were the ones that felt right in your bones, even when your head couldn't explain why. The ride to Luke's ranch passed in careful silence, both of them acutely aware of the strangeness of their situation. Annalise sat sideways behind him on Patience, her carpetbag clutched in her lap, trying not to think about how this arrangement must appear to anyone who might see them. A scarred woman riding with a man she'd known for less than an hour. It was the sort of thing that would fuel gossip for months. But as they left the town behind and the open country stretched before them, something in her chest began to loosen. The mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, and the afternoon sun painted the grassland in shades of gold and amber. It had been so long since she'd seen anything beautiful without feeling the weight of others' stares that she'd almost forgotten how it felt to simply observe and appreciate. Luke's ranch appeared gradually. First the windmill turning lazily. In the breeze, then the barn and corral, and finally the small farmhouse nestled among cottonwood trees. It wasn't grand, but it had a settled, peaceful quality that spoke of people who had put down roots with intention and care. "It's lovely," Annalise said, as Luke helped her down from the horse. And she meant it. There was something honest about the place, something that didn't try to be more than it was. "Could use some work," Luke replied, but she heard pride in his voice despite the self-deprecating words. "Let me show you the barn." The barn was larger than she'd expected, with solid timber walls and a roof that showed no signs of leaking. The smell of hay and horses filled the air, not unpleasant but earthy and alive. Luke led her to a small room at the back corner, opening the door to reveal a space that was indeed better than some places she'd stayed. Someone had clearly prepared for her arrival. A narrow bed stood against one wall, made up with clean quilts. A small table sat beneath. The single window and a modest iron stove occupied the corner, with a neat stack of firewood beside it. The floor was wooden planks, swept clean, and someone had even hung a piece of oiled cloth over the window for privacy. "You did all this today?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of the table. Luke shifted uncomfortably. Wasn't much to do, had most of it already, but Annalise noticed the fresh straw on the floor, the way the quilts still held the scent of soap, the small jar of wildflowers on the table that definitely hadn't been there long. He'd taken time to make this space welcoming, and the thoughtfulness of it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." He nodded, clearly eager to escape the emotion in her voice. "I'll let you get settled. Supper's usually around 6, nothing fancy." After he left, Annalise sat on the edge of the bed and opened her carpetbag. Her possessions looked even more meager spread out in this new space. 2 extra dresses, undergarments, a few personal items, and at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in a piece of silk, a small hand mirror that had belonged to her mother. She hesitated before unwrapping it, knowing what she would see. The mirror had been broken during her escape from the fire, a spider web of cracks that divided her reflection into fragments. For months, she'd avoided looking at herself, but now, in this quiet room where no one else could see, she slowly lifted. The mirror, the cracks made her scars look even more dramatic, dividing her face into pieces that didn't quite align. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hollow-eyed, marked by pain, carrying a sadness that seemed to have settled into her very bones. She traced one of the larger scars with her finger, remembering how smooth her skin had once been. How Thomas used to say she was the prettiest girl in Philadelphia. A soft knock at the door made her quickly wrap the mirror and push it back into the bag. "Miss Ward," Luke's voice was carefully respectful, "I brought some things you might need." She opened the door to find him holding a basin and pitcher with a small towel draped over his arm. "Thought you might want to wash up before supper." "That's very thoughtful." She took the basin, their fingers brushing briefly. His hands were calloused but gentle, the hands of a man who worked hard but wasn't hardened by it. "The pump's just outside if you need more water," he said, "and there's a privy behind the barn. Not fancy, but it's clean." After he left again, Annalise poured water into the basin and splashed her face, careful around the tender scars. The water was cold and clean, and for the first time in months she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She was safe. She had shelter, and the man who had offered both asked nothing of her except honest work. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but perhaps it could be the beginning of something better than what she'd left behind. As she prepared for her first supper on the Carver ranch, Annalise allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to belong somewhere again. 3 weeks had passed since Annalise's arrival at the ranch, and a comfortable routine had settled between them, like dust finding its natural place. She rose before dawn to tend the chickens and collect eggs, prepared breakfast while Luke handled the morning chores, and spent her days mending clothes, organizing the small household, and learning the rhythm of ranch life. Her pregnancy was becoming more noticeable, but the physical work seemed to agree with her, bringing color back to her cheeks and a steadiness to her movements. Luke had proven to be a man of few words, but consistent kindness. He never stared at her scars, never made her feel like a burden or an object of pity. Their conversations were practical at first, discussions about meals, chores, the weather, but gradually they'd begun to share small pieces of their histories. She learned that he'd lost both parents, that the ranch was struggling financially, that he read books by lamplight and had opinions about things beyond cattle and crops. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when their peaceful arrangement was shattered by the sound of a wagon approaching the house. Luke looked up from his coffee, frowning. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones were usually the bearers of bad news. "Stay inside," he said quietly, moving to the window. "Looks like official business." Annalise's blood turned cold. She recognized the type immediately. A well-dressed man in a dark suit stepping down from a rented buggy, carrying a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained documents that would complicate someone's life. Behind him came another figure that made her stomach lurch with recognition. "Thomas," she whispered. Thomas Brennan looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, well-groomed, with the confident bearing of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. He wore an expensive coat and carried himself with the easy authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes accommodated. The sight of him brought back a flood of memories she'd worked hard to suppress. Luke's jaw tightened as he watched. The two men approached the front porch. "You know him, my former fiancé." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "The father of my child." The knock came sharp and authoritative. Luke opened the door, but didn't invite the men inside, positioning himself in the doorway in a way that made it clear they weren't welcome. Mr. Carver, the lawyer, for he could be nothing else, pulled a document from his satchel. "I'm Attorney Davidson from Denver. I represent Mr. Thomas Brennan in a matter concerning one Annalise Ward." "Miss Ward is under my protection," Luke said evenly. "State your business." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes scanning the modest farmhouse. With obvious disdain, "My business is with Annalise. I've come to claim what's rightfully mine." "You gave up any rights you had when you sent her away," Luke replied, his voice carrying a quiet menace that Annalise had never heard before. Davidson cleared his throat importantly. "Actually, Mr. Carver, the matter is more complex than that. Miss Ward was under contract to marry Mr. Brennan. When she failed to appear at the arranged time and place, she violated the terms of that agreement." "She appeared," Luke said. "Your client chose not to honor his commitment." "Due to material misrepresentation," Thomas interjected smoothly. "Annalise failed to disclose her condition in our correspondence. Both her physical condition and her delicate state." Annalise felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but anger quickly followed. She moved to stand beside Luke, meeting Thomas's gaze directly, despite the way his eyes flickered away from her scars. "I disclosed everything you needed to know in my letters," she said firmly. "The fire happened after our arrangements were made. As for the child, you seemed quite eager to ensure its conception during your visit to Philadelphia." Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable, but Davidson pressed on. "Regardless of the circumstances, Mr. Brennan has legal obligations toward his child. He's prepared to make a generous settlement." "In exchange for what?" Luke asked. "Miss Ward's agreement to certain conditions. She would relocate to a suitable establishment where she can be properly cared for during her confinement. After the birth, custody arrangements would be made for the child's welfare." The words hit Annalise like physical blows. An establishment, some place where inconvenient women could be hidden away from polite society. And custody arrangements that would separate her from her child, leaving her with nothing, while Thomas raised her baby as a respectable heir to his family fortune. "No," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I won't be hidden away like some shameful secret, and I won't give up my child." Thomas finally looked directly at her, and she saw something cold and calculating in his expression. "You're being unreasonable, Annalise. Look at yourself. Look at this place. What kind of life can you offer a child? I'm prepared to provide education, opportunities, a respectable future. And what about her future? Luke's voice was dangerously quiet. What happens to Miss Ward in this arrangement? Davidson shuffled his papers. Mr. Brennan is prepared to be generous, a modest allowance enough to live quietly somewhere suitable, somewhere out of sight, where her presence wouldn't embarrass Thomas or complicate his respectable life. Annalise felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, not just for herself, but for the child growing within her. My answer is no, she said firmly. I have a home here and I have work. I don't need your charity or your establishments. Thomas's face darkened. This isn't over, Annalise. I have rights and I have resources. Don't force me to use them. As the two men returned to their buggy, Luke placed a gentle hand on Annalise's shoulder. Are you all right? She watched the dust cloud following the departing wagon and realized that her hands were shaking. He means to take my baby, not while I have anything to say about it, Luke said quietly, and something in his tone made her believe him. That evening, Luke sat at his kitchen table long after supper was finished, turning his mother's wedding ring over in his calloused fingers. The simple gold band caught the lamplight, worn smooth by years of faithful wearing. Beside it lay his father's ring, heavier and more masculine, but equally worn by a lifetime of honest work and steady devotion. Annalise had retreated to her room in the barn after the confrontation with Thomas and his lawyer, claiming she was tired. But Luke had seen the way her hands trembled as she cleared the supper dishes, the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting them to return at any moment. Fear had settled around her like a cloak, and it made something protective and fierce rise in his chest. He'd been thinking about marriage for hours now, turning the idea over in his mind like a problem that needed solving. Not romantic love. He was practical enough to know that such things took time to grow, if they grew at all. But marriage as a legal shield, a way to protect her and the child from Thomas Brennan's claims and society's judgment. The more he considered it, the more sense it made. Annalise needed protection and security. He needed help with the ranch and, if he was honest with himself, companionship. They got along well, respected each other, and shared similar values about hard work and treating people with dignity. Many successful marriages had been built on less. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Annalise standing on his porch, wrapped in one of his mother's old shawls against the October chill. I couldn't sleep, she said, quietly. I keep thinking about what he said, about having resources, about rights. What if he can take my baby? Luke stepped aside to let her enter, noting how small and vulnerable she looked in the lamplight. Come sit by the fire. We need to talk. She settled into his mother's rocking chair, and Luke took his usual place across from her. The rings lay on the table between them, catching the firelight like small promises waiting to be made. I've been thinking about your situation, he began carefully, about legal protections and what might keep you and your child safe. Annalise's eyes found the rings, and understanding flickered across her features. Luke, you don't have to hear me out. He leaned forward, his voice earnest. Thomas can make claims about an unmarried mother, about custody rights and what's best for the child. But he can't make those same claims about a married woman whose husband accepts the child as his own. You're talking about a marriage of convenience. I'm talking about protection for you and the baby. Luke picked up his mother's ring, holding it carefully. It wouldn't have to be. That is, you'd keep your room in the barn if you wanted. Nothing would change except the legal papers. Annalise was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded over her growing belly. And what would you get from such an arrangement? The question was fair, and Luke found himself considering his honest answer. Help with the ranch, someone to share the work and the responsibility, and... He paused, struggling with words for feelings he barely understood himself. I've been alone for 2 years now. It gets quiet out here. Too quiet sometimes. You could find someone else. Someone without complications, without scars, without another man's child. Luke met her eyes directly. I don't want someone else. The simple statement hung between them, loaded with more meaning than either was quite ready to examine. Annalise looked away first, her fingers tracing the edge of the shawl. Thomas has money, Luke. Lawyers, influence. If he decides to fight this, let him fight. Luke's voice carried a steel she'd never heard before. I may not have his resources, but this is my land, my community. I know these people and they know me. A man's word still means something here. The townspeople already whisper about me living here. If we married, the townspeople will find something else to whisper about soon enough. Luke reached across the table and took her hand, surprised by how right it felt. Annalise, I'm not offering you romantic love or promises I can't keep, but I can offer you respect, protection, and a home where you and your child will always be welcome. She studied his face in the firelight, searching for something, doubt, pity, ulterior motives. But all she saw was the same steady kindness. He'd shown her from the beginning, now tempered with determination. Why, she asked softly, why would you tie yourself to someone like me? Luke thought of his mother's voice, of the way she'd always said that character revealed itself in how people treated those who had nothing to offer in return. He thought of Annalise's quiet dignity, her willingness to work despite her condition, the way she'd stood up to Thomas despite her fear. Because someone like you deserves better than what the world has given you so far, he said simply. And because I think we could build something good together, something honest. Annalise looked down at their joined hands, his rough and scarred. From work, hers soft but marked by different kinds of hardship. Two people who'd learned that life rarely unfolded according to plan, but who hadn't given up on the possibility of finding peace. All right, she said quietly. I accept your proposal, Luke Carver. As he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, Luke felt something shift in the quiet farmhouse. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow into love with time and care and the daily choice to honor each other. The wedding took place 3 days later in Reverend Patterson's small church, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Annalise wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that had once been fashionable in Philadelphia, but now served as her only respectable option. Luke had cleaned up as much as possible, his dark hair combed back and his Sunday shirt pressed carefully with an iron heated on the stove. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on picking wildflowers for a simple bouquet, her motherly instincts overriding any gossip she might have heard about the hasty ceremony. Every bride deserves flowers, she'd said firmly, pressing the bundle of late-blooming asters into Annalise's hands. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, much like the arrangement that had prompted it. They spoke their vows in steady voices, each understanding that these words were both protection and promise, not of romantic love, but of mutual respect and shared responsibility. When Luke slipped his father's ring onto his own finger and declared them husband and wife, Annalise felt a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty settle over her. Back at the ranch, the awkwardness of their new status became immediately apparent. They stood in the kitchen like strangers, both unsure of how to navigate this change in their relationship. The rings on their fingers felt foreign, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to explore. I'll move my things to the spare room, Luke said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. You should have the main bedroom, especially with the baby coming. Luke, I couldn't take your parents' room. It wouldn't be right. It's the practical thing to do. His tone was gentle but firm. The spare room suits me fine, and you'll need more space soon enough. That evening, as Luke moved his few possessions to the smaller room, Annalise found herself alone in the kitchen with his mother's recipe book. The leather-bound volume was worn soft from years of use, its pages filled with careful handwriting and notes about successful attempts and failed experiments. Sarah Carver had documented everything, from basic bread recipes to elaborate holiday meals, from remedies for sick cattle to instructions for preserving vegetables. Ma always said cooking was love made edible, Luke said, appearing in the doorway, with an armload of clothes. He paused, watching her turn the pages carefully. She'd want you to use it, add your own recipes, make changes. It wasn't meant to be a museum piece. Annalise traced a recipe for apple butter, noting the careful annotations about cooking times and preferred apple varieties. She had beautiful handwriting. School teacher before she married Pa always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Luke set his clothes down and moved closer, pointing to a particular page. That's her cornbread recipe. Best you'll ever taste, though I've never been able to make it come out quite right. Perhaps it's the cook, not the recipe, Annalise suggested with a small smile. Perhaps it is. Their first breakfast as a married couple was a careful dance of politeness and practical consideration. Luke had risen early to tend the animals, returning to find Annalise already preparing eggs and coffee with an efficiency that impressed him. She'd used his mother's recipes to make biscuits that were light and perfectly golden, and the coffee was stronger than he usually managed. "This is excellent," he said, and meant it. "Thank you. I found some preserves in the cellar. Peach, I think. Your mother's? 2 summers ago. She made extra that year, said she had a feeling they'd be needed." Luke paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "She would have liked you, I think. Would have appreciated your practicality." It was a small compliment, but it warmed Annalise more than flowery speeches might have. Practicality was something she understood, something she could offer with confidence. Their days began to develop a new rhythm. Luke handled the outdoor work. Cattle, fences, the endless maintenance that ranch life required. Annalise managed the household with growing confidence, learning to cook on the temperamental stove, mastering the art of keeping the fire burning just right, discovering which of the hens were reliable layers and which were merely decorative. In the evenings, they shared simple meals and practical conversation. Luke would read aloud from newspapers when he had them, or they'd discuss plans for the ranch, problems that needed solving, small improvements that could be made. It wasn't romantic, but it was comfortable. The kind of partnership that many marriages aspired to, but few achieved. The town's reaction to their union was mixed but predictable. Some whispered about the hastiness of the ceremony, others about Luke's questionable judgment in taking on a scarred woman carrying another man's child. But there were also those who nodded approvingly at his Christian charity, and a few who simply accepted that Luke Carver was a good man who'd made a practical decision. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile was among the more generous in her assessment. "That boy needed help with that ranch," she told anyone who would listen, "and she needed a husband. Sometimes life works out better than romance novels would have you believe." As their first week of marriage drew to a close, both Luke and Annalise began to feel the tentative hope that they'd made the right choice. Not for love, perhaps, but for something equally valuable. The chance to build a life based on mutual respect and shared purpose. November brought the first serious snow, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Annalise stood at the kitchen window, watching Luke trudge through the drifts to check on the cattle, his breath visible in small puffs of vapor. Her pregnancy was becoming more pronounced now, 5 months along, and she found herself moving more carefully, her hand often resting on the growing curve of her belly. It was during one of these snowy afternoons that Luke surprised her by appearing in the kitchen with an armload of cedar planks and his father's woodworking tools. "What's all this?" she asked, looking up from the bread dough she was kneading. Luke set the wood carefully on the table, running his hand along the smooth grain. "Thought the baby might need a proper cradle. This cedar's been seasoning in the barn for 2 years. My father planned to use it for something special." Annalise felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby's movements. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the way he'd referred to the baby as if it were already his own, the quiet assumption that this child would be welcomed and cherished, it touched something deep inside her that she'd thought Thomas had destroyed. "You don't have to. I want to." Luke's voice was firm but gentle. Every child deserves to be welcomed properly into the world. Over the following weeks, the sound of careful craftsmanship filled the kitchen in the evenings. Luke worked slowly and methodically, sanding each piece until it was silk smooth, joining the corners with precise dovetails that would last for generations. Annalise found herself watching his hands as he worked. Strong, capable hands that handled the delicate wood with surprising gentleness. "You're skilled at this," she observed one evening, admiring the graceful curve he was shaping for the cradle's rockers. "Pa taught me. Said a man should be able to make what his family needs." Luke paused in his work, looking at her across the table. "He made Mary's cradle and mine. This wood, he was saving it for grandchildren he never got to meet." The weight of that legacy settled between them, the hopes of previous generations, the continuing cycle of family and tradition. Annalise thought of her own parents, gone now for 3 years, and how they would have loved to see their grandchild, rocking in a cradle made with such care. "Tell me about them," she said softly. "Your parents." Luke set down his tools and leaned back in his chair. Ma was the educated one, could quote Shakespeare and solve arithmetic problems that made Pa's head spin, but she loved this land like it was part of her soul. She'd walk through the pastures in the morning just to watch the sun come up over the mountains. And your father, stubborn as a mule and twice as hard-working, never met a problem he wouldn't try to solve with determination and elbow grease. Luke smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. They argued sometimes. Ma wanted to plant flower gardens. Pa said they were a waste of good soil. But every spring, he'd surprise her with seeds for her roses. They loved each other completely. It wasn't always easy. The drought of '69 nearly broke them, and they lost 2 babies between Mary and me. But they held on to each other through all of it. Annalise felt a wistful pang at the picture he painted. A marriage built on deep affection and shared dreams, so different from her own practical arrangement. But then she looked at Luke's hands, still holding the piece of wood he'd been shaping for their child, and wondered if perhaps affection could grow from such beginnings. As December arrived, the cradle neared completion, and with it came a shift. In the dynamics of their household, Luke had begun asking for her opinions on small details, the height of the sides, the placement of a decorative carving, whether the finish should be left natural or lightly stained. These conversations led to others. Plans for expanding the chicken coop, ideas for improving the kitchen, dreams they both harbored but had never shared. One evening, as snow fell steadily outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Annalise felt the baby kick strongly enough to make her gasp and press her hand to her side. "Is everything all right?" Luke was instantly alert, half rising from his chair. "Just active tonight." She smiled, rubbing the spot where a tiny foot seemed to be exploring the boundaries of its confined world. "I think this little one is going to be a handful." Without thinking, Luke moved closer, his eyes fixed on her hand. "May I?" he asked quietly. Annalise hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Luke placed his palm gently beside hers, and as if summoned by the warmth of his touch, the baby delivered another strong kick directly into his hand. Luke's face lit up with wonder and something deeper, a protective tenderness that transformed his features entirely. "Strong," he murmured. "Going to be a fighter." "Like his father," Annalise said without thinking, then blushed at her own words. But Luke didn't correct her assumption about paternity. Instead, he kept his hand where it was, feeling the movements of the child he was already claiming as his own, and something passed between them in the firelight. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but recognition of the deeper bond they were building together. Like both his parents, Luke said finally, and in those words, Annalise heard the promise of a future where her past didn't define her worth, where her child would be raised by a man who chose to love them both. December brought bitter cold and the kind of challenges that tested both character and marriage. When old Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring homestead arrived at their door one morning, her face pinched with cold and worry, Annalise knew immediately that trouble had found them. "It's my grandson Billy," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice shaking. With more than the chill. "Took a bad fall from the barn loft. Doc Miller's snowed in at the Hendricks place, and I don't know what to do. The boy's burning with fever, and his leg. It's not right." Luke was already reaching for his coat. "I'll saddle Patience and—" "No," Annalise spoke firmly, surprising them both. "The snow's too deep for riding, and you don't know enough about fever or broken bones. But I do." She'd learned basic medical care from her mother, who'd served as an unofficial nurse in their Philadelphia neighborhood. More importantly, she'd helped tend the burn victims after her own accident, learning hard lessons about infection and proper wound care that no formal training could have provided. "Annalise, in your condition," Luke began, "my condition makes me pregnant, not helpless." She was already gathering supplies. Clean cloth, the bottle of whiskey Luke kept for special occasions, needle and thread, the herbs she'd found growing wild and carefully dried. "Mrs. Peterson, how far is your place?" 2 miles through the woods. "There's a path, but with this snow, we'll manage." Annalise looked at Luke, seeing the concern in his eyes, but also trust in her judgment. "Can you rig the sled?" The journey through the snow-covered forest was treacherous but beautiful, the silence broken only by the whisper of sled runners and the soft thud of Luke's snowshoes. He'd insisted on pulling the sled himself, not trusting the horse's footing. In such conditions, Annalise rode bundled in quilts, one hand protecting her belly while the other clutched her makeshift medical kit. Billy Peterson was 14, tall for his age, but still carrying the gangly awkwardness of adolescence. He lay on his grandmother's kitchen table, his face flushed with fever and his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. The break was bad, but not compound, a blessing that made Annalise's job possible rather than hopeless. "Luke, I need you to hold him steady," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Mrs. Peterson, put water on to boil, and find me the straightest pieces of wood you have, long enough to reach from his ankle to his hip." What followed was 2 hours of careful, painstaking work. Setting the bone required all of Luke's strength, to hold the boy still while Annalise manipulated the brake back into alignment. Billy screamed once, a sound that made Mrs. Peterson weep and Luke's jaw clench with sympathy, but then mercifully fainted, making the rest of the procedure easier. Annalise worked with steady concentration, her scarred hands moving with surprising skill and gentleness. She splinted the leg using wooden slats and strips of torn sheeting, checked for circulation, and cleaned the scrapes on Billy's arms with practiced efficiency. When the fever-reducing tea was ready, she showed Mrs. Peterson exactly how much to give and how often. "He'll sleep now," she said finally, washing her hands in the warm water. "The fever should break by tomorrow if we've caught it in time. Change the bandages if they get dirty, and don't let him put weight on that leg for at least 6 weeks." Mrs. Peterson grabbed Annalise's hands, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You saved him. I know you did. How can I ever thank you?" "By getting well yourself," Annalise replied gently, noting the older woman's exhaustion. "You've been caring for everyone else, but you need rest too." The journey home was slower, both of them tired but satisfied with the day's work. Luke pulled the sled with steady determination, occasionally glancing back to make sure Annalise was comfortable. The snow had stopped, and stars were beginning to appear through breaks in the clouds. "You were remarkable today," Luke said, as they finally reached their own barn. "I've never seen anyone work so calmly under pressure." Annalise felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "My mother always said that panic never healed anyone. You just do what needs doing." Still, Luke helped her down from the sled, his hands lingering at her waist. "Billy's lucky you were here. We all are." That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple supper, Luke brought out a bundle of fabric that he'd been working on in secret. Unfolded, it revealed a quilt of extraordinary beauty. Not fancy or elaborate, but carefully crafted with small, even stitches and a pattern that spoke of patience and attention to detail. "For the baby," he said simply. "I know you've been piecing together scraps, but I thought every child should have something made just for them." Annalise ran her fingers over the soft cotton, noting how he'd chosen colors that would suit either. A boy or girl, soft blues and greens, with touches of yellow like sunshine. The pattern was a simple star, but the workmanship was exquisite. "You made this?" "Ma taught me when I was laid up with a broken arm one winter. Said needlework was good for developing patience and precision." Luke looked almost embarrassed. "I know it's not usual for a man to—" "It's perfect." Annalise held the quilt against her cheek, feeling the love that had been stitched into every seam. "Our baby will be so lucky to have this, to have you." Words hung between them, loaded with more meaning than either was quite ready to acknowledge. But in the firelight, wrapped in the quiet satisfaction of a day's good work, and surrounded by the small domestic comforts they'd built together, both began to understand that what they'd found might be more valuable than the passionate love either had dreamed of in their youth. Word of Billy Peterson's recovery spread through the community with the speed that only good news can achieve in a small town. Within a week, Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile had stopped by with a basket of preserves for the woman who saved young Billy, and even the stern-faced banker Mr. Crawford had tipped his hat to Annalise when he passed her on the street. The shift in how people treated her was subtle but unmistakable. Where once there had been averted eyes and uncomfortable silences, now there were nods of acknowledgement and genuine inquiries about her health. The scars on her face hadn't changed, but somehow they seemed less important than the skill in her hands and the kindness in her heart. It was on a crisp January morning that Luke made a discovery that would change how Annalise saw herself forever. He'd been cleaning out his father's old desk, looking for the deed papers that the bank required for their loan extension, when he found something unexpected tucked behind a drawer. A pressed wildflower, dried and fragile with age, carefully preserved between two pieces of glass. "Annalise," he called from the front room, "could you come here for a moment?" She found him standing by the window, holding the pressed flower up to catch the morning light. It was a simple prairie rose, the kind that bloomed wild across the Wyoming landscape every summer, nothing rare or exotic, but beautiful in its quiet, unpretentious way. "I found this in Pa's desk," Luke said, turning the glass frame in his hands. "Ma must have pressed it their first summer here. She always said the plainest flowers were often the most beautiful, if you knew how to really see them." He looked at Annalise then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not pity or charity, but recognition of something precious that others might overlook. "Like you," he said simply, holding out the pressed flower, "beautiful in ways that matter more than what shows on the surface." Annalise took the delicate frame with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of his words settle around her like a warm cloak. For so long, she'd defined herself by her scars, by what the fire had taken from her. But standing in the morning sunlight, holding this testament to beauty found in simple things, she began to see herself through Luke's eyes, not as damaged goods, but as someone worthy of careful preservation and gentle appreciation. "I want you to have it," Luke continued, "for our room, for your room. Something beautiful to look at when the world feels ugly." The February blizzard that followed tested every ranch in the territory, but it also revealed the strength of the community that had slowly begun to embrace them. When their chimney developed a dangerous crack during the worst of the storm, it was Billy Peterson who spotted the smoke pattern from his grandmother's house and sent word. Within hours, despite the howling wind and driving snow, 3 neighbors, had arrived with tools and materials to make emergency repairs. "Can't have the doc's missus freezing to death," joked Tom Mitchell, the blacksmith, as he and Luke worked to remortar the chimney stones. The casual reference to Annalise as the doc brought surprised smiles from everyone present, including Annalise herself. "I'm not a real doctor," she protested, but Mrs. Peterson waved away her objections. "You doctored my Billy better than anyone with a fancy degree could have done. That's real enough for us." As winter gradually gave way to early spring, the changes in their relationship became more pronounced. Luke had begun seeking out Annalise's opinion on ranch decisions, asking her advice about everything from which fields to plant to weather. They should invest in a new bull. More importantly, he'd started sharing his dreams, tentative plans for expanding the operation, ideas about crops that might grow well in their soil, hopes for the future that included her and the baby as integral parts. Their conversations had evolved from polite practicality to genuine friendship, peppered with shared laughter and comfortable silences. Luke would read aloud from books while Annalise sewed by lamplight, or they'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, while discussing everything from politics to philosophy to their hopes for their unborn child. One evening in early March, as Annalise worked on tiny clothes for the baby, now due in just 2 months, Luke appeared at her elbow with something cupped carefully in his hands. "First crocus of the season," he said, opening his palms to reveal a small purple flower, bright and defiant against the lingering patches of snow. "Thought you might like to see it." Annalise looked up from her sewing to find Luke watching her, with an expression that was tender and uncertain and full of unspoken feelings. The crocus sat in his calloused palm like a promise that spring would come, that new life would emerge from the frozen ground, that beautiful things could bloom even in the harshest conditions. "It's lovely," she said softly, but she was looking at his face when she said it, noting the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentle strength in his expression, the growing affection that he no longer tried to hide. "Not as lovely as you," Luke replied, and this time, when he said it, Annalise almost believed him. March brought the kind of restless energy that comes with the promise of spring, and with it, a shift in the atmosphere between Luke and Annalise that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Her pregnancy was now in its 7th month, making her movements slower and more deliberate, but also lending her a glow that Luke found increasingly difficult to ignore. It was during one of those soft evening hours, when the light slanted golden through the kitchen window and the baby's movements were strong enough to be visible through her dress, that Luke made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been organizing his father's papers in preparation for the bank meeting when he found it, a letter he'd written weeks ago, but never sent, hidden beneath a stack of receipts where he'd forgotten about it. The letter was addressed to his sister, Mary in Denver, written during one of those long February nights when the wind howled around the house and his thoughts had turned to the woman sleeping in the room down the hall. In careful script, he'd poured out feelings he couldn't voice aloud. How Annalise's presence had transformed his lonely house into a home, how her quiet strength had become the foundation on which he built each day, how somewhere in the practical arrangement of their marriage he'd found something that felt remarkably like love. "I know it makes no sense," he'd written. "She came here broken and frightened, carrying another man's child, and I offered her shelter, thinking I was being charitable. But Mary, she's given me so much more than I've given her. She's made me believe that I might be worthy of something good after all. I think about telling her how I feel, but I'm afraid of ruining what we have. What if she only stays because she needs protection? What if I'm mistaking gratitude for something deeper?" The letter felt dangerous in his hands now. Evidence of vulnerability. He wasn't sure he was ready to share. But as he read his own words, Luke realized that the feelings he'd described had only grown stronger in the weeks since he'd written them. The question was no longer whether he loved Annalise Ward Carver. The question was whether he was brave enough to tell her. That same evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Annalise noticed Luke's unusual quietness. He kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression thoughtful and somewhat troubled. Finally, she set down her mending and faced him directly. "You've been peculiar all evening," she said with gentle directness. "What's troubling you?" Luke looked at the letter in his lap, then at Annalise's face in the firelight. Her scars had faded somewhat over the months, becoming part of her rather than dominating her features, and her eyes held a serenity that hadn't been there when she first arrived. She was beautiful, not despite her scars, but including them, because they were part of the journey that had brought her to him. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," he said carefully, "about whether it's working the way we hoped." Something flickered across Annalise's face. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. "Have I done something wrong? If you're unhappy with my work—" "No." Luke leaned forward, reaching for her hand. "Annalise, you've done everything right. More than right. You've made this place feel alive again." "Then what?" Luke struggled with words for feelings that seemed too large for language. "When we married, we agreed it was for practical reasons. Protection for you and the baby, help for me with the ranch. But I wonder sometimes if the practical reasons are still the only ones." Annalise's breath caught, understanding flooding her features. "Luke, I don't want to complicate things," he said quickly. "I don't want you to feel obligated or uncomfortable, but I need you to know that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just an arrangement for me." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, making Annalise gasp and press her hand to her side. Luke was instantly alert, concern overriding everything else. "Are you all right?" "Just active tonight," she smiled, covering his hand with hers and guiding it to where the movement was strongest. "I think this little one likes the sound of your voice." Luke felt the baby's movements beneath his palm and was struck by the profound intimacy of the moment, not romantic intimacy, but something deeper. This child would know no father but him, would grow up thinking of Luke Carver as the man who'd chosen to love them both. The responsibility of that was overwhelming and precious in equal measure. "Annalise," he said softly, "I need you to know that when I look at you, I don't see charity or obligation. I see the woman who saved Billy Peterson's life, who can make my mother's bread recipe better than my mother ever did, who turned a house into a home just by being in it. I see someone I'd choose again, every day, if I had the chance." Tears gathered in Annalise's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "Even with my scars, even with another man's child—" "Especially with your scars," Luke said firmly. "They're proof of what you've survived, of how strong you are. And this child—" He moved, his hand gently over her belly. "This child is ours now in every way that matters." In the firelight, surrounded by the quiet comfort of the home they'd built together, both Luke and Annalise finally acknowledged what had been growing between them all along. Not the desperate passion of youth, but something steadier and more enduring, love that had grown from respect, deepened through shared trials, and would last because it was built on the solid foundation of truly knowing each other. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the spring thaw had made the ground treacherous and unpredictable. Luke had been working to repair a section of fence damaged by winter storms, using a block and tackle to lift a heavy beam into position, when the rope snapped without warning. The beam came down hard, catching his left leg beneath it and pinning him to the muddy ground. Annalise heard his shout from the kitchen, where she'd been preparing the midday meal. The sound, pain and surprise mingled with something that might have been fear, sent her running despite her ungainly condition, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found him conscious but pale, trapped beneath the massive timber with his leg bent at an angle that made her stomach clench with worry. Blood seeped through his torn pants, and she could see him fighting to stay calm despite the obvious pain. "Don't try to move," she said, kneeling beside him in the mud, her practiced hands already assessing the situation. "How bad is the pain?" "Bad enough." Luke's voice was tight but steady. "The beam's got my leg pinned, but I can feel my toes. That's good, right?" That's very good. Annalise looked at the heavy timber, calculating angles and leverage points, with the eye of someone who'd learned to solve problems under pressure. I'm going to get you out of there, but I need you to stay as still as possible. Using the same block and tackle system that had failed Luke, Annalise rigged a new arrangement with rope she found in the barn. Her movements were slower than usual. The seam maybe made bending difficult, and she had to pause frequently to catch her breath, but her hands were steady and sure. Luke watched her work with a mixture of admiration and concern. Annalise, in your condition, maybe you should ride to town for help. By the time I could get to town and back with help, you could be in serious trouble. She tested the rope. Tension, satisfied with her rigging. Besides, I've lifted heavier things than this beam, just not recently. The process of freeing him required careful coordination. Annalise operated the pulley system while talking Luke through the process of sliding free as the weight lifted. When the beam finally cleared his leg, she heard him exhale in relief, though his face remained pinched with pain. "Let me see," she said, carefully cutting away the torn fabric of his pants to expose the injury. The leg was badly bruised and bleeding from several deep cuts, but the bone appeared intact. "Can you wiggle your toes?" Luke demonstrated, wincing at the movement. "Hurts like the devil, but everything seems to work." Annalise's medical kit had grown considerably since her experience with Billy Peterson. She cleaned the wounds with careful precision, noting that while the cuts were deep, none appeared to have damaged major vessels. The real concern was the extensive bruising and possible internal damage to the muscle and soft tissue. "You're going to be off this leg for at least a week," she said, binding the wounds with clean cloth. "Probably longer, and you'll need to keep it elevated to reduce swelling. I can't stay in bed for a week. The cattle need tending, and there's planting to think about. The cattle will survive, and the planting can wait." Annalise's voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Luke Carver, you hired me to help with this ranch, and right now helping means making sure you don't do something foolish that turns a manageable injury into a permanent problem." Getting Luke to the house required ingenuity and patience. Using a makeshift stretcher, constructed from fence boards and horse blankets, Annalise managed to transport him to their bedroom, where she established him with pillows to elevate his leg and strict instructions to remain still. Over the following days, their roles reversed completely. Annalise took over the outdoor chores as much as her pregnancy allowed, rising early to feed the chickens and collect eggs, checking on the cattle, and managing the 100 small tasks that kept the ranch functioning. Luke chafed at his enforced inactivity, but Annalise was merciless in her insistence that he rest. "You're enjoying this," he accused on the third day, watching her organize his medications with professional efficiency. "I'm enjoying seeing you take care of yourself for once." She felt his forehead for fever, satisfied to find it cool. "You spend so much time worrying about everyone else, the ranch, me, the baby. Someone needs to worry about you." It was during those quiet hours of recovery that their relationship deepened in ways neither had expected. Confined to bed, Luke became more talkative, sharing memories and dreams he'd never voiced before. Annalise found herself telling him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her parents' love story, about the dreams she'd abandoned, and the new ones that were taking their place. "I never thanked you properly," Luke said one evening, as Annalise changed his bandages with gentle hands. "For what? For saving my life today, for taking care of everything, for—" He struggled with words, for feelings that seemed too large for language, for being exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know I needed it. Annalise looked down at his leg, nearly healed now but still tender, then at his face in the lamplight. "We take care of each other," she said simply. "That's what families do." The word hung between them, family, acknowledging what they'd become through choice and circumstance and the daily decision to honor their commitment to each other. April brought warm sunshine and the kind of hope that comes with lengthening days and the promise of new life. Luke's leg had healed well enough for him to resume light duties, though Annalise still insisted he avoid heavy lifting. Her pregnancy had entered its final weeks, and Dr. Miller had pronounced both mother and baby healthy during his monthly visits. It was on one of those perfect spring mornings when the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their first green. Buds and the meadowlarks filled the air with their liquid songs that the photographer arrived. Samuel Wright was a traveling man who made his living capturing family portraits for ranching families who rarely had the opportunity to preserve such memories. "Heard you folks might be interested in a photograph," he said, setting up his elaborate camera equipment in the yard. "Nothing finer than having a picture to mark special times, new babies, anniversaries, family milestones." Luke looked at Annalise, noting how the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair and brought out the peaceful contentment in her expression. She'd been beautiful that first day at the train station, beneath the fear and scarring, but now she glowed with something deeper, the confidence of a woman who knew she was loved exactly as she was. "What do you think?" he asked her quietly. "Would you like a photograph?" Annalise touched her belly self-consciously. "I'm so large now, and my face—" "Your face is perfect," Luke said firmly, loud enough for the photographer to hear. "And I want to remember this moment. You, me, our baby on the way, this ranch that's become our home. I want to remember how happy we are." The word surprised them both. Happy. It wasn't something either had thought to claim for themselves, but standing there in the morning sunshine, with everything they'd built together spread out around them, there was no other word that fit. Mr. Wright positioned them carefully on the front porch, Luke standing behind Annalise's chair, with his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The pose was formal by necessity. Photography required stillness, but something in their expressions captured the easy intimacy they'd developed over the months. "Now hold very still," Wright instructed, disappearing beneath his black cloth. "This will take about 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds of enforced stillness, Annalise found herself cataloguing everything she wanted to remember about this moment. The warmth of Luke's hand through her dress, the solid presence of him behind her, the way the baby seemed to settle peacefully as if sensing the importance of the occasion. This was her family, not the one she'd planned for, but the one she'd been blessed with despite everything. When the photograph was developed an hour later, both Luke and Annalise were amazed by what the camera had captured. The formal pose couldn't hide the genuine affection in their expressions, the way Luke's eyes held protective tenderness as he looked down at his wife, the serene confidence in Annalise's face as she rested her hand over her growing child. "You look beautiful," Luke said, studying the image with wonder. "Both of you do. We look like a real family," Annalise replied, her voice soft with emotion. "We are a real family." That afternoon, as they sat on the porch enjoying the warm weather, Annalise felt the first unmistakable signs that their baby was ready to make its appearance. The pains started as a low ache in her back, so subtle she almost dismissed them as the usual discomfort of advanced pregnancy. But as the hours passed, the contractions became stronger and more regular. "Luke," she said during supper, setting down her fork as another wave of pain swept through her, "I think it's time." Luke was immediately alert, all the calm competence he'd developed over months of ranch emergencies, focusing on this new crisis. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Annalise breathed through another contraction, timing it carefully. "We should send for Dr. Miller, but don't panic. First babies usually take their time." But their baby, it seemed, had inherited its parents' practical efficiency. Dr. Miller arrived just as the sun was setting, and by the time the stars appeared in the clear Wyoming sky, Margaret Sarah Carver had made her entrance into the world, healthy, strong-voiced, and bearing a remarkable resemblance to her adoptive father around the eyes. "She's perfect," Luke whispered, holding his daughter for the first time, with the careful reverence of a man who'd never dared dream of such happiness. "Look at those tiny fingers." Annalise watched her husband, for that's truly what he'd become. Cradle their child with infinite gentleness, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new depth of love. Margaret had Luke's dark hair and serious expression, but when she opened her eyes, they were the same deep blue as Annalise's own. "She knows you," Annalise said softly, as the baby settled peacefully in Luke's arms. "Look how calm she is with you." "She's ours," Luke said simply, but the words carried the weight of a sacred vow. "Whatever else happens, wherever she came from, she's ours now." As the three of them sat together in the lamplight, exhausted, overwhelmed, and completely happy, Annalise thought about the photograph they'd taken that morning. It had captured them on the threshold of this moment, poised between the family they'd been becoming and the family they'd now become in full. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were complete. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, delivered by a grim-faced postal clerk who seemed to understand its significance before Luke even opened it. Margaret was 6 weeks old, sleeping peacefully in her cedar cradle, while Annalise prepared breakfast and Luke reviewed the previous month's accounts at the kitchen table. The envelope bore the official seal of First National Bank of Wyoming Territory, and Luke's hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal. Inside, the language was formal and unforgiving, but the meaning was crystal clear. The Carver Ranch was in default on its loan payments, and the bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings. They had 30 days to pay the full amount owed, $847, or lose everything. "What is it?" Annalise asked, noting the color draining from Luke's face. Luke handed her the notice without speaking, watching as she read through the legal terminology with growing alarm. When she finished, she set the paper down carefully and moved to stand behind his chair, her hands resting on his shoulders in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Bad as it gets." Luke's voice was hollow. "I knew we were behind, but I thought I had more time. The cattle market has been poor, and with the expenses from Margaret's birth, Dr. Miller's bills." He trailed off, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their situation. $847 might as well have been $8,000 for all the hope they had of raising it in 30 days. Their cattle were healthy, but few in number, and current market prices wouldn't bring nearly enough. The crops wouldn't be ready for harvest until late summer, and even then a good year would barely cover their basic expenses. "There has to be something we can do," Annalise said, though her voice carried more determination than confidence. "We could sell some of the equipment, or take in boarders, or—" "Annalise," Luke covered her hands with his own. "I've been through every possibility a dozen times. The equipment isn't worth enough, and who would board way out here? Face it, I've failed. I couldn't save my father's ranch, couldn't provide for my family, couldn't even keep a roof over our heads." The despair in his voice broke Annalise's heart, but it also sparked something fierce and protective within her. This man had saved her when no one else would, had given her a home and a family, and shown her what it meant to be truly valued. She would not let him give up on the life they'd built together. "We haven't failed anything," she said firmly, moving around to face him, "and we're not giving up." That afternoon, while Luke rode out to check on the cattle with the heavy weight of defeat on his shoulders, Annalise took stock of their actual assets. She went through every room of the house, every corner of the barn, cataloguing anything that might have value. Hidden in the bottom of Luke's mother's trunk, she found a small jewelry box containing a pearl necklace and matching earrings. Sarah Carver's wedding jewelry, saved for special occasions that had never come. The pieces were beautiful but modest, probably worth $50 at most. Still, it was something. Annalise also found her own pearl brooch, a confirmation gift from her parents that she'd somehow managed to keep through all her travels. Together, the jewelry might bring $75, a significant sum but nowhere near enough. It was while nursing Margaret that evening that the idea came to her, sudden and clear as a bell. She thought about the grateful faces of the families she'd helped, Billy Peterson, recovering fully now and working his grandmother's farm, the 3 other children she'd tended during the winter months when Dr. Miller couldn't reach them through the snow. She thought about the skills her mother had taught her, the knowledge she'd gained through necessity and experience. "Luke," she said as he came in from the evening chores, his face still bearing the weight of their troubles. "I want to talk to Dr. Miller tomorrow. Annalise, if this is about the money we owe him, it's not about what we owe him, it's about what I can offer him." She settled Margaret more comfortably in her arms, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "People around here need medical help, especially the women and children. Dr. Miller can't be everywhere at once. And there are things I know how to do: childbirth, basic surgery, treating fevers and infections." Luke stared at her, beginning to understand. "You want to work as his assistant? I want to work as a medical practitioner, not a doctor. I'm not trained for that. But something like a midwife or nurse. Dr. Miller could train me in the things I don't know, and I could handle the cases he doesn't have time for." Annalise's eyes were bright with possibility. "People would pay for that kind of help, Luke. Not a lot, maybe, but steady income, enough to make our loan payments and keep the ranch." For the first time since receiving the foreclosure notice, Luke felt a spark of hope. He looked at his wife, brilliant, determined, unafraid to fight for what mattered, and marveled again at how fortunate he'd been to find her. "You really think it could work?" "I think we have to try," Annalise replied. "This ranch is our home, Luke, our daughter's inheritance. I won't let them take it without a fight." In the lamplight, with their baby sleeping peacefully between them, and the weight of their shared determination filling the room, both Luke and Annalise felt something they hadn't experienced in days: the belief that they might actually find a way through this crisis together. The confrontation came on a sweltering June morning, just as Annalise was preparing to leave for her first official day working with Dr. Miller. She had spent the previous week learning proper medical procedures and expanding her knowledge of pharmaceuticals, and the doctor had been impressed enough to offer her a formal position as his assistant and midwife. The arrangement would provide steady income, not enough to solve their financial crisis immediately, but sufficient to negotiate with the bank for more time. Margaret was napping in her cradle when the sound of approaching horses disturbed the morning quiet. Luke looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression darkening as he recognized the riders. Thomas Brennan had returned, but this time he'd brought more than just his lawyer. 3 men in business suits accompanied him, along with a territorial marshal whose badge caught the sunlight ominously. "Stay inside," Luke told Annalise. But she was already moving toward the door, her jaw set with determination. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever this is about, I won't hide from it." Thomas dismounted from his hired horse with the elaborate care of a man unaccustomed to such transportation. He was dressed expensively but looked haggard, as if the journey from Denver had taxed him more than he'd expected. His eyes, when they fixed on Annalise, held a mixture of desperation and calculation that made her stomach clench with foreboding. "Annalise," he said, attempting his old charm despite the circumstances, "you're looking well. Motherhood agrees with you." "State your business, Brennan," Luke interrupted, positioning himself between Thomas and his family. "You're not welcome here." Attorney Davidson stepped forward, consulting a thick sheaf of legal documents. "Mr. Carver, we're here on a matter of territorial law regarding the custody of a minor child born out of wedlock to Miss Annalise Ward." "Mrs. Annalise Carver," Luke corrected coldly. "And any child born to my wife is my child, legally and morally." "Actually," Davidson continued with the smug confidence of a man who believed himself to hold all the cards, "the matter is more complex than that. Mr. Brennan has recently completed arrangements to legitimize his claim to the child through marriage to Miss Ward, which would supersede any subsequent arrangements she may have made." Annalise felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I'm already married, Mr. Davidson, as you well know." Thomas smiled then, and the expression was neither kind nor apologetic. Actually, my dear, that's precisely the issue we've come to resolve. It seems there was a slight irregularity in our original arrangement, one that has significant legal implications. He nodded to Davidson, who produced a document with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. Mrs. Carver, I present to you the marriage certificate of Thomas Brennan and Miss Catherine Elmwood, dated October 15th, 1872, 3 months before your own marriage contract with Mr. Brennan was signed. The words hit Annalise like physical blows. She stared at the certificate, noting the official seals and signatures, the carefully recorded details that couldn't be disputed. Thomas had been married, legally, officially married, during the entire time he'd been courting her, planning their future, sharing her bed, and creating the child who now slept peacefully just yards away. You were already married, she whispered, the full implications crashing over her. Our engagement, the promises you made, everything, it was all fraud. A complicated situation, Thomas admitted, with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. Catherine's family insisted on discretion due to certain financial arrangements, but the marriage was quite legal, I assure you. Luke's hands had clenched into fists, and he stepped closer to Thomas with barely controlled rage. You son of a... Careful, Mr. Carver, the marshal warned, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. Let's keep this civil. Davidson cleared his throat importantly. The legal implications are quite clear. Since Mr. Brennan was already married when he engaged Miss Ward, their contract was invalid from the beginning. However, as the biological father of the child and now a legally single man, Mrs. Brennan passed away in childbirth last month. Mr. Brennan has the right to claim custody of his offspring. Annalise's mind reeled with the revelation. Thomas's wife had died, leaving him free to pursue his claim. But more importantly, his original fraud meant that she had never been legally bound to him at all. She had been free to marry Luke, free to make her own choices, free from the shame she'd carried for months about breaking a sacred promise. Wait, she said slowly, her lawyer's daughter mind working through the implications. If Thomas was already married when he made promises to me, then I was never legally obligated to honor our arrangement. I was a free woman who was deceived and abandoned. Which brings us to the current situation, Davidson continued smoothly. Mr. Brennan is prepared to be generous. He's offering a substantial settlement for the child's custody, plus compensation for Miss Ward's difficulties over the past year. The answer is no, Luke said quietly, but his voice carried the force of absolute conviction. Margaret is my daughter now, legally adopted through my marriage to her mother. You have no claim on her. Thomas's facade of civility finally cracked. That child is my blood, Carver, my heir. You think I'll let some failed rancher raise a Brennan? You think I'll let the man who defrauded and abandoned my wife claim any rights over our daughter? Luke shot back. The marshal stepped between them, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. Gentlemen, this is a matter for the courts to decide. Mr. Brennan has filed a formal petition for custody, and there will be a hearing next week in Cheyenne. As the legal party prepared to leave, Thomas turned back to Annalise with one final attempt at manipulation. Think carefully about this, my dear. You know what I can provide. Education, social standing, financial security. What can this farmer offer compared to that? Annalise looked at her husband, standing protectively beside her, ready to fight the world for their family. She thought of the cedar cradle he'd carved with his own hands, the gentle way he held their daughter, the life they'd built together through mutual respect and growing love. Everything that matters, she said firmly. Everything that actually matters. The courthouse in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity on the morning of the custody hearing. Word of the unusual case had spread throughout the territory. A contest between a wealthy businessman and a struggling rancher for the custody of a child born to a scarred woman who'd been abandoned at a train station. It was the kind of story that captured imaginations and divided opinions along lines of class, morality, and justice. Luke sat at the defendant's table wearing his only good suit, cleaned and pressed, but showing its age in the careful patches and worn fabric. Beside him, Annalise held Margaret close, the baby mercifully quiet despite the tension that filled the room. Their lawyer, James Morrison, no relation to the man who'd abandoned Annalise, was young and enthusiastic, but hardly a match for the expensive legal team that Thomas had assembled. Judge Samuel Crawford was known for his fairness and his impatience with legal theatrics. A territorial judge for 15 years, he'd seen enough family disputes to recognize the human cost of such proceedings. His weathered face revealed nothing as he called the court to order. "This is a petition for custody of the minor child known as Margaret Sarah Carver," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Mr. Davidson, present your case." Davidson rose with theatrical confidence, painting a picture of Thomas Brennan as a successful businessman who could provide his biological daughter with every advantage: private education, cultural refinement, social connections that would open doors throughout her life. He emphasized Thomas's financial resources, his family's standing in Denver society, and his legal rights as the child's father. "Your Honor," Davidson concluded, "while we sympathize with the unfortunate circumstances that led to this situation, we cannot allow sentiment to override the child's best interests. Mr. Brennan can provide opportunities that a failing ranch never could." The testimony that followed was brutal in its efficiency. Thomas took the stand, wearing an expensive suit and projecting the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He spoke eloquently about his desire to know his daughter, his plans for her education, his ability to provide financial security. Under cross-examination, however, cracks began to appear in his polished presentation. "Mr. Brennan," Morrison asked, "when did you first learn that Miss Ward was carrying your child in Philadelphia before she departed for Wyoming? And what was your response to this news?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I was pleased, naturally. A child is a blessing. Yet you sent her away to marry another man while you remain married to someone else. How do you reconcile that with your current claim of paternal devotion? The circumstances were complex. Yes or no, Mr. Brennan, when you sent Miss Ward to Wyoming, did you intend to claim custody of her child?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Thomas answered. "At that time, no. In fact, you only became interested in claiming this child after your wife died and you learned that Miss Ward had found happiness with another man. Isn't that correct?" Davidson's objections couldn't hide the damage. Thomas's motives looked increasingly selfish and calculated, rather than paternal and caring. When Luke took the stand, his testimony was simple and direct. He spoke about finding Annalise at the train station, about their gradual building of trust and affection, about the moment Margaret was born and became his daughter in every way that mattered. His voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity when he described his love for both Annalise and Margaret. "Mr. Carver," Davidson challenged during cross-examination, "can you provide for this child's education? Can you guarantee her financial security? Can you offer her the social advantages that Mr. Brennan can provide?" Luke looked directly at the judge when he answered, "Your Honor, I can offer her a home where she's wanted for herself, not for what she represents. I can teach her the value of honest work, the importance of keeping your word, and how to treat all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. I can show her every day that she's loved completely and unconditionally." But it was Annalise's testimony that proved most powerful. She took the stand with quiet dignity, holding her head high, despite the way some spectators stared at her scars. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events that had brought her to Wyoming: the fire, Thomas's abandonment, Luke's unexpected kindness. "Mrs. Carver," Morrison asked, "who do you believe should raise your daughter?" "The man who chose to." "Love her before she was born?" Annalise replied without hesitation. "The man who carved her cradle with his own hands, who held her first when she came into this world, who calls her by name and sings to her when she cries. Margaret's father isn't the man who contributed to her conception. It's the man who chose to be her father every day since. The courtroom stirred as several spectators nodded in agreement. Judge Crawford called for order, but his expression had shifted subtly. The most dramatic moment came when Dr. Miller took the stand as a character witness. The respected physician testified not only about Luke and Annalise's character, but also about Annalise's growing reputation as a skilled medical practitioner. "Your Honor," Dr. Miller concluded, "in my 40 years of practice, I've rarely seen someone with Mrs. Carver's natural healing ability and genuine compassion for others. She saved lives, including that of young Billy Peterson. This is a woman who makes her community better simply by being part of it." When all testimony was concluded, Judge Crawford announced that he would render his decision after a brief recess. The wait felt interminable, as families on both sides of the case gathered in small groups, whispering and speculating about the outcome. Finally, the judge returned to his bench, his expression grave but certain. The packed courtroom fell silent as he prepared to speak, everyone understanding that his next words would determine the fate of a family and the future of one small girl who slept peacefully through the proceedings that would determine her destiny. Judge Crawford's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he addressed the packed courtroom. "In the matter of Brennan versus Carver, custody of the minor child Margaret Sarah Carver, this court has considered all testimony and evidence presented." The silence was so complete that Margaret's soft breathing seemed loud in the vast room. Luke reached for Annalise's hand, finding it cold but steady, and drew strength from her unwavering composure. "The law is clear that biological parentage creates certain rights and responsibilities," the judge continued. "However, the law also recognizes that the best interests of the child must supersede all other considerations. In this case, we have a man who abandoned his responsibilities when they became inconvenient, who left a pregnant woman to face an uncertain future alone, and who now seeks to claim what he previously rejected." Thomas shifted uncomfortably at the defendant's table, his expensive lawyers exchanging worried glances. "Conversely," Judge Crawford continued, "we have a man who accepted responsibility freely, who provided shelter and protection when it was needed most, and who has proven his commitment through consistent action rather than convenient words. The court finds that Mr. Luke Carver has acted as this child's father in every meaningful sense since before her birth." Luke felt Annalise's hand tighten in his, but neither dared to hope yet. "Furthermore," the judge said, his voice growing stronger, "the court notes that Mr. Brennan's original engagement to Miss Ward was fraudulent, entered into while he was already legally married to another woman. This deception absolves Miss Ward of any obligation and makes Mr. Brennan's current claims morally questionable at best." A murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's stern look. "The petition for custody is denied, Margaret. Sarah Carver will remain with her legal parents, Luke and Annalise Carver, who have proven their devotion through deed rather than declaration. Furthermore, this court orders that Mr. Brennan cease all attempts to contact or claim this child, as his parental rights are hereby formally terminated." The gavel came down with finality, and the courtroom erupted. Luke pulled Annalise close, both of them too overwhelmed with relief to speak. Margaret chose that moment to wake and look around with the serious expression she'd inherited from her father, as if she understood that something important had just been decided in her favor. Thomas stormed from the courtroom without a word, his legal team following with obvious disappointment. As the crowd dispersed, several community members approached to offer their congratulations. Mrs. Peterson, Tom Mitchell, the blacksmith, even stern-faced Mr. Crawford from the bank, who had traveled to Cheyenne to witness the proceedings. "Reckon this calls for a celebration," Dr. Miller said, beaming as he admired Margaret's alert expression. "And Mrs. Carver, I believe we have work to do. There are several expectant mothers in the territory who could benefit from your expertise. The journey home to their ranch took on the quality of a victory parade. Word of the court's decision had somehow traveled faster than their wagon, and they found neighbors gathered in their yard, not to gawk or gossip, but to welcome them home and celebrate the preservation of their family. Mrs. Henderson had organized the women to prepare a feast. Tom Mitchell had repaired their front gate as a surprise, and Billy Peterson, now fully recovered and grown tall over the summer, had painted their barn with fresh whitewash that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Couldn't let the Doc's family come home to a shabby place," he explained with a grin that reminded everyone of how close they'd come to losing him the previous winter. As evening settled over the ranch and the last of their well-wishers departed, Luke and Annalise found themselves alone on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Margaret slept peacefully in her mother's arms, finally secure in the family that had chosen her completely. "I keep thinking I should feel different," Annalise said quietly, "more relieved or victorious or something, but mostly I just feel grateful." Luke understood. The court's decision hadn't changed who they were or what they meant to each other. It had simply confirmed what they'd known all along. They were a family built on choice rather than chance, on daily commitment rather than blood ties, on love that had grown strong enough to weather any storm. "Look," Luke said, pointing toward the western horizon where the first star was appearing in the deepening sky. "Make a wish." Annalise closed her eyes for a moment, then smiled. "I wished that we'd always remember how we felt right now, that, no matter what challenges come, we'd remember that we chose each other and that choice made us stronger than any of us could have been alone." Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden cross his mother had carved, worn smooth now by years of handling. "Ma always said that the most beautiful things grow in the most unexpected places," he said, placing it gently in Margaret's tiny hand. "I think she would have been proud of what we've built here." As the stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, the three of them sat together in the peaceful quiet of home. Not the home they'd planned for, but the one they'd been blessed to find. And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their love and the promise of their future, they knew that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that begin with broken hearts and grow strong enough to heal anything.